Ajaz Budi, stay where you are.
I'm not saying one word without my CW represent.
The 39,000 in cash from the bedroom.
You ring up.
Every move Ajaz Budi made for the last 3 years inside that sorting office was being recorded. He's seconds away from finding out exactly how much the cameras caught. 2.3 million pounds in stolen checks. Hundreds of envelopes lifted from the sorting bays of Britain's busiest mail center.
CW Bridge House right now, or this conversation is over.
The intercepted mail in the wardrobe matches the envelopes from the Mount Pleasant.
I am a serving postman with 19...
3 years of a serving Royal Mail postman, 19 years inside the red uniform, walking out of Mount Pleasant with somebody else's money tucked under his arm. By the time investigators were finished tracing it, one corporate victim had lost over £807,000. A bedroom in a Leyton terraced house was holding £39,000 in cash, and the historic heart of London's postal network had been quietly turned into a private skim operation by the man you just watched on this footage. Before we go any further, how much do you actually think about the people who handle your post? You drop a letter into a red pillar box and you assume it gets where it's going. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had something important go missing in the mail. And if you're new to the channel, hit subscribe. We hold these insider cases up to the light every single week, and the next one is already in the pipeline. Ajaz Budi was born in East London in the summer of 1980. Into a working-class British-Pakistani family that had settled in the borough of Waltham Forest 2 decades earlier. His father drove a minicab out of a small office on Lea Bridge Road, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and saving every pound he could spare for the deposit on the narrow terraced house the family would eventually buy on a side street in Leyton. His mother worked the sewing machines at a garment factory in Hackney during the day and took in alterations from the neighbors in the evenings. By the time Ajaz was old enough to remember his first day at primary school, the family of 7 was sharing 4 bedrooms in a red brick Victorian terrace. And the rule in the house was that nobody complained about the cold, and nobody asked for second helpings unless one of the parents offered first. Ajaz was the 3rd of 5 children. He was a quiet boy, by all accounts, polite to teachers, never in serious trouble, and remembered by his primary school year tutor as the kind of student who would tidy the classroom at the end of the day without being asked. He attended a comprehensive school in Walthamstow, the kind of place where the buildings dated to the 1950s, and the playing field doubled as the football pitch, and the rugby pitch, and the rounders pitch, depending on the term. His teachers later remembered him as average, academically, well-behaved, popular enough with his year group, and never the boy you would have picked out of a class photograph and predicted any kind of trouble for. He left school at 16 with 5 GCSEs, and no real plan beyond getting a wage packet into his mother's hand at the end of every week. His uncle, his father's younger brother, had been working at the Mount Pleasant Mail Center in Clerkenwell for almost a decade by then, a postman on a Holborn round, and put in a word with one of the shift managers when the center opened its books for Christmas casual hires in the autumn of 1996. Ajaz turned up for his first shift at 5:15 on a Monday morning in early November, wearing a borrowed waterproof jacket because nobody had told him a uniform would be issued, and was put straight to work humping mail sacks off the back of an articulated lorry onto a wheeled cage. He earned £3.80 an hour as a temporary hand. He worked every shift they offered him for the 6 weeks running up to Christmas, and when the casual contracts ran out in mid-January, the shift manager pulled him aside in the canteen and asked whether he had ever thought about applying for a permanent appointment. He had not. He applied the same week. The interview was a formality. By the end of February 1997, at 16 years and 8 months of age, Ajaz Budi was a full-time Royal Mail postman, badge number issued, uniform measured, training scheduled at the Mount Pleasant induction unit on the Roseberry Avenue side of the building. The training lasted 4 weeks. He learned the manual sorting frames, the postcode geography of central London, the protocols for handling registered mail and special delivery, the safety procedures for the parcel cages and the conveyor belts that fed the automated letter sorters. His training officer's end-of-course report described him as punctual, attentive, and quick to learn the postcode layout, and noted that he had finished the postcode memorization test 6 minutes faster than the cohort average. He was placed on a round in Holborn, working alongside the uncle who had got him through the door. For 19 years he wore the red uniform. He was promoted exactly once from grade 1 to grade 2 postman in 2002, a routine progression that came with an increase of less than £15 a week in his basic pay. He never sat the supervisory exams. He never applied for a desk role or a shift leader position. He turned up at Mount Pleasant 6 mornings out of 7, did his round, and went home. His annual appraisals across the late 1990s and the 2000s were uniformly unremarkable. Phrases that appeared in his file year after year included reliable, punctual, good rapport with the public on his round, no disciplinary issues to report, and on one occasion, written by a shift manager who had only known him for 8 weeks, an asset to the center. He married at 22. His wife was a cousin's friend from a Pakistani family in Walthamstow, and the wedding was held over 3 days at a community hall in Leyton, with several hundred guests across the events. The couple moved into a small rented flat above a halal butcher shop on Leyton Bridge Road for the first 18 months of the marriage, and then put down a deposit on the narrow 2-up, 2-down terrace on Sanderstead Road in Leyton, where Ajaz would still be living the morning that the Metropolitan Police arrived at his front door 11 years later. Their first daughter was born in 2004. A son followed in 2007. A second daughter arrived in 2010. By the time the third child was crawling, Ajaz Budi was 30 years old, the father of 3 children under 7, a homeowner with a substantial mortgage, and a Royal Mail postman on a basic wage of £375 a week before tax. To understand what Ajaz Budi was about to do, you have to understand the building he was about to do it inside. The Mount Pleasant Mail Centre, officially the London Central Mail Centre, sits on a 12-acre site between Farringdon Road and Roseberry Avenue in the borough of Islington, a short walk from the Old Bailey, and a shorter walk from the offices of half the corporate solicitors in central London. The site has been a mail handling facility in one form or another since 1889, originally built on the bones of a Victorian-era prison. By the late 1990s, when Ajaz Budi started his first shift there, Mount Pleasant was processing in the region of 2.5 million letters and parcels every single working day. It was, by some measures, the largest sorting office in the world. The volume was the point. The volume was also the vulnerability. Mount Pleasant operated 3 rolling shifts around the clock, employing several thousand staff across the early morning sort, the daytime parcel stream, and the overnight letter run. Mail came in by lorry from every postcode region in the United Kingdom and was processed, redistributed, and pushed back out within hours. The automated letter sorters could handle tens of thousands of items an hour. The parcel bays were broken into corporate, retail, and standard tiers, each fed by its own conveyor system. The whole operation was a choreography of moving sacks and trolleys and trays, and the only way it functioned at speed was on the assumption that the postmen feeding the machines and pulling the trays off the racks were doing exactly what postmen were supposed to do. Individual letters were not tracked. They could not be. The cost of tagging every envelope through a sorting office that handled close to 1 billion items a year would have eaten the entire profit margin of the Royal Mail business, and so the system relied on something cheaper. It relied on trust. Letters arrived in bulk, were sorted into postcode bundles, were loaded into trays, and were sent out into the city on the back of red Royal Mail vans, driven by red uniformed postmen who had passed a background check, signed a contract, and worn the Crown logo on their chest for an average of 12 years apiece. Parcels were a marginally tighter operation. Registered items and special delivery packages were barcoded and scanned at entry and exit, and any deviation in the scan trail was supposed to flag an internal alert. But ordinary first-class and second-class parcels, the kind that carried, among many other things, business checks posted between corporate accounts departments and their suppliers, were not tracked at the sorter level. They were tracked at the depot of origin and the depot of destination, and in between those two scans, they moved through Mount Pleasant in a fog of paper and plastic that nobody had the manpower to audit in real time. Camera coverage of the sorting halls was extensive but uneven. The loading bays were heavily monitored. The parcel cages were covered from multiple angles. The letter sorting frames, the long pigeonhole walls where postmen flicked envelopes into individual slots by hand, were photographed less aggressively. Anti-theft enforcement was largely reactive. The internal fraud team investigated complaints, not patterns. The internal audit team sampled, but did not search. The trust that the whole system depended on was the trust the British public had placed in the red uniform for the best part of 200 years. The postman was an institution. The postman did not steal. Nobody is quite sure when Ajaz Budi took the first one. Investigators later traced the operation back to a window of roughly 3 years before his arrest. But the earliest documented check diversion in the police case file was dated to a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2010, when an envelope addressed to an accounts department in Manchester left Mount Pleasant in Ajaz Budi's pocket instead of on a Royal Mail van bound for the M1 motorway. The method was not complicated. He did not need it to be. Ajaz Budi worked the sorting frames every morning. He had access, by virtue of his shift assignment, to the bulk letter stream that flowed through the center between 4 and 7 a.m. He knew, after 14 years of handling envelopes for a living, which corporate clients used, which envelope formats. He knew the cream-colored franked envelopes that meant a payment from an insurance broker. He knew the brown window envelopes with the right-hand stamp panel that meant a bank statement or an accounts check. He knew the heavy A4 manila envelopes with the embossed corporate seal in the top left corner that meant a high-value commercial transaction. After a decade and a half on the sorting line, his eye for which envelopes were worth opening was sharper than any audit algorithm Royal Mail had deployed at the center. He did not steal from his own round. That was the cleverness of it. A postman who started losing envelopes off his own delivery route would have shown up in a complaint pattern within weeks. Angry customers ringing the Royal Mail call center, businesses chasing up missing payments, postcodes flagged for investigation. So Ajaz Budi pulled mail from across the center. He took envelopes addressed to postcodes he had never delivered to in his life. He took mail destined for North London, South London, East London streets he had no reason to be on. He took envelopes addressed to streets he did not even know existed. By spreading the theft across the whole geography of the city, he diluted the pattern beyond the point where any one round, any one postcode, any one customer service team could see it. He smuggled the mail out in the lining of his postman's jacket and in the bottom of his issued shoulder bag. he smuggled it out in the storage compartments of his Royal Mail van, tucked behind the spare high-vis vest and the empty parcel cages. When he had a particularly heavy day's haul, he left envelopes inside locked metal cabinets in the staff cloakroom and collected them at the end of his shift on the way out through the staff exit on Phoenix Place, where the security check at the gate was rarely more than a wave-through for uniformed postmen returning vehicles. The checks he was lifting were not made out to him. They could not be cashed by him personally. That was where the network came in. Ajaz Budi had two co-conspirators, both of them named in the indictment, but neither of them a Royal Mail employee. The first ran a small number of bank accounts opened in the names of dormant or shell companies whose registered details matched, closely enough, the payee names on a portion of the stolen checks. The second was the contact who got the deposits through the banking system, without triggering the anti-fraud holds that should have caught them. The investigation later established that there was an insider at one of the banks, a clearing-side employee who, for a percentage of each successful deposit, would manually clear flagged check deposits before the automated fraud system pulled them for review. The proceeds were laundered in part through cash. Substantial amounts of money were withdrawn from the dummy accounts within days of each clearance and physically carried back to addresses where Ajaz Budi could store them. Partly the terraced house on Sanderstead Road, partly the flat of a second woman with whom he had begun a separate relationship in the months before the operation started in earnest, and whose address would later become the second seizure site in the police investigation. For the first 18 months, the scheme ran without a single detected anomaly. Ajaz Budi turned up at Mount Pleasant at 4:45 every morning. He did his sorting shift. He walked his round in Holborn or Clerkenwell or wherever the rota had assigned him that week. He came home to Sanderstead Road. He took the kids to the park on Sundays. He paid the mortgage. He kept his car serviced. He kept buying his lunch from the canteen at Mount Pleasant for £2.20 and bringing home the same £375 weekly pay packet he had been bringing home for years. Anyone looking at his lifestyle from the outside would have seen nothing. That, too, was the point. Postmen who started driving new BMWs and taking package holidays to Dubai got noticed by their colleagues and their managers. Ajaz Budi did not. He stayed inside the lifestyle of a £375 a week postman, and the cash piled up in stacks inside 2 bedrooms in 2 boroughs of East London. By the time the Royal Mail fraud team turned its first camera on the relevant sorting bay, the face value of the checks that had passed through Ajaz Budi's hands and into his network's bank accounts had crossed the £2 million mark. The unraveling did not begin at Mount Pleasant. It began in an accounts department in the City of London, in the offices of a corporate finance firm that had been waiting for the better part of a month for a settlement check from a counterparty in Birmingham to arrive in the post. The check, the firm's accounts manager confirmed by phone, had been issued, posted, and confirmed as collected from the sender's outgoing mail. It had then vanished somewhere between the Birmingham sorting office and the City of London delivery round. The face value of the missing check was just over £807,000. The firm filed a formal complaint with Royal Mail. So, in the same week, did 3 other companies. So, in the following month, did 7 more. By the autumn of 2012, the Royal Mail Internal Fraud Investigation Team, a small, specialist unit headquartered in a discreet office some distance from any actual sorting hall, was looking at a pattern of high-value commercial mail going missing in transit, and a pattern of complaints that was beginning to share one common feature. every missing item had passed through Mount Pleasant. The fraud team did not move quickly. They did not, in the language of one of the investigators who would later give evidence at trial, want to spook the bird. They knew from previous insider cases that confronting a suspect at the wrong stage of an investigation tended to lead to evidence vanishing, network scattering, and stolen mail being burned in back gardens before search warrants could be drawn up. So, they made a different decision. They asked a small number of trusted Mount Pleasant managers to authorize the discreet installation of additional cameras inside the sorting halls. Cameras positioned not on the cages or the loading bays, but on the letter sorting frames themselves, with sight lines onto the trays and the staff who worked them. The cameras ran for weeks. Investigators reviewed footage in shifts. They watched several hundred postmen do their jobs across thousands of hours of recording, and for most of those hours they watched nothing happen at all. Postmen flicked letters into pigeonholes. Postmen pushed trolleys from one end of the floor to the other. Postmen drank tea on their breaks and read The Sun on their lunch hours, and walked out of the building at the end of their shifts, with nothing in their pockets but car keys and the corner of a sandwich. And then they watched Ajaz Budi. What the cameras captured, repeatedly and unambiguously, was a uniformed Royal Mail postman with 19 years of service, standing at a sorting frame and picking through bundles of mail that did not belong to his round. Envelopes addressed to streets he did not deliver. Postcodes outside his geographic remit. Corporate franked envelopes from companies he had no reason to be handling. The footage showed him separating those envelopes from the bundles he was meant to be sorting, tucking them into the lining of his jacket or the bottom of his shoulder bag, and continuing as if nothing had happened. Then, 20 minutes later, the cameras would catch him doing it again. The Royal Mail fraud team did not arrest him. They did not have the power to. What they had, by the end of the surveillance window, was a recorded body of evidence sufficient to take to the Metropolitan Police, and a single named suspect whose identification number, shift pattern, home address, vehicle registration, and family circumstances had been compiled into a file that ran to several hundred pages. They handed all of it to the Met. The Met opened a warrant application. The application was granted. The next decision, made in a Metropolitan Police briefing room in late 2012, was to coordinate the search of 3 addresses on the same morning. The raids went in at first light. Officers from the Metropolitan Police, accompanied by Royal Mail investigators and supported by a forensic financial unit, entered 3 premises simultaneously. The terraced house on Sanderstead Road in Leyton, the second-floor flat in another East London postcode where Ajaz Budi's girlfriend lived, and the Royal Mail vehicle compound at Mount Pleasant where his assigned van was parked overnight. What they found at the Leyton address alone would have been enough to charge him. The terraced house, on the surface, was a perfectly ordinary East London family home. 3 bedrooms, a small front garden, children's bicycles propped against the side gate, a wheelie bin pulled out on the curb for the Tuesday collection. Inside, the front room held a flat-screen television and the kind of brown leather settee that had been on sale at DFS the year it was bought. The kitchen was tidy. The kids' bedrooms were strewn with toys. The master bedroom was different. Inside the master bedroom, officers found, in a series of locations across the room, under the bed, inside a wardrobe, behind a stack of folded towels in an airing cupboard, and inside the lining of a suitcase pushed to the back of a built-in wardrobe, bundles of letters, envelopes, check stubs, credit card application forms, bank statements, and corporate correspondence that did not belong to anyone living at the address. The envelopes were addressed to streets across the M25, to corporate addresses in the city, to private residents in postcodes Ajaz Budi had never delivered to in his life. Some of the envelopes had been opened. Some had not. Some had the checks removed, with the empty envelopes preserved, investigators later theorized, as a working record of which items had been processed and which were still in the pipeline. In the same bedroom, officers recovered cash, bundles of 20-pound notes and 50-pound notes wrapped in elastic bands, distributed across enough hiding places that the count, when the seizure was finished and totaled, came to almost 39,000 pounds across the two addresses. The girlfriend's flat held its own share. The Royal Mail van held more stolen mail in the rear cargo compartment, and additional letters were found inside Ajaz Budi's personal car, parked on the curb outside the Leyton house. The smoking gun was already on tape. The covert sorting office footage from the Royal Mail fraud team showed Ajaz Budi in uniform on shift, on a working morning, lifting envelopes from sorting bundles that had nothing to do with his route. The same kinds of envelopes, many of them traceable by specific postmark, specific franked address, specific corporate sender, turned up days or hours later inside his Leyton bedroom or the back of his Royal Mail van. The chain of custody between the sorting floor at Mount Pleasant and the bedroom on Sanderstead Road was no longer a question of inference. It was on camera at one end and in evidence bags at the other. Forensic accountants traced the financial side, the dummy bank accounts, the deposits, the insider at the clearing bank, the cash withdrawals, the pattern of small physical sums moving back into Ajaz Budi's circle in increments small enough to avoid the reporting thresholds. Every step was documented. Every step had a paper trail. We're about to walk into the courtroom. Before we do, if you've made it this far, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And consider hitting subscribe. We cover insider fraud cases like this every week, and the next one in the pipeline is even harder to believe. The arrest itself took place at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning in 2012 on the doorstep of the Sanderstead Road house. Ajaz Budi answered the door in a gray hooded sweatshirt and tracksuit bottoms. He had not yet left for his shift. His wife was upstairs with the youngest of the 3 children. The 2 older children were still in bed. 3 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stood on the doorstep. The senior officer had the warrant in his hand. "Mr. Ajaz Budi?" "Yeah. I'm Detective Sergeant Marlin, Metropolitan Police. We have a warrant to search this address in connection with an ongoing investigation into theft from Her Majesty's mail." "Can you step aside, please, sir?" There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause where a man does the arithmetic in his head and runs out of options halfway through. He stepped aside. "I'm going to ask you to remain in the kitchen with one of my officers while the search is carried out, Mr. Budi. Do you understand?" "Yeah, I understand." What is this? What do you think you've got?" "We have reason to believe items of stolen mail are being held at this address. There's no stolen mail in this house." "We're going to find out one way or another, sir." His wife came down the stairs holding the baby. She asked what was happening. Nobody answered her. The officers were already moving up the stairs. Ajaz Budi sat at the kitchen table in his gray hoodie, hands flat on the formica, and did not say another word for the next 38 minutes. It was a uniformed constable on her first search of the morning who found the first bundle of stolen envelopes under the master bed at 6:51. She called it in over the radio. The senior detective came back down the stairs. He looked at Ajaz Budi sitting at the kitchen table. He did not say anything immediately. He waited. Ajaz Budi looked back at him. "Is there anything you want to tell me, Mr. Budi?" "I want a solicitor." "That's your right, sir. I'm not saying anything else." He did not. He went silent, and he stayed silent, all the way through the search, all the way through the formal arrest at the front door, all the way through the drive to the station, all the way through the booking process, and all the way through the interview that followed. The Crown Prosecution Service charged Ajaz Budi with 8 separate offenses. The charges spanned 2 statutes: theft under Section 1 of the Theft Act 1968, and possession of articles for use in fraud and possession of criminal property under the Fraud Act 2006 and the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, respectively. The total value of mail referenced on the indictment exceeded £2.3 million. The number of individual victim companies named in the supporting schedule ran into the dozens. The case was committed to the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, and listed for trial in 2013. Budi was represented by a defense solicitor from a London-based firm with experience in fraud and proceeds of crime work, and at trial by junior counsel who advanced a defense that was, by the standards of the evidence against him, modest in its ambition. The defense did not seriously contest that the stolen mail had been found at the Sanderstead Road address. They could not. What they argued instead was that the precise scope of Mr. Budi's role within the wider network was less than the prosecution alleged, that he had been a participant rather than the organizer, that the value he had personally benefited from was lower than the face value of the diverted checks, and that the operation had ramped up around him in ways he had not fully controlled. The jury did not accept it. The covert surveillance footage was played in court. Investigators walked the jurors through the matching between specific intercepted envelopes and specific fraudulent deposits. Forensic accountants explained the dummy accounts and the cash trail. A representative of one of the victim companies, the corporate finance firm that had lost the single largest item, the £807,556 settlement check, gave evidence on what the loss had meant to the firm's operations and to its relationships with the counterparties whose payments had vanished. Their statement to the court was read aloud during the sentencing phase. The relevant passage included the following: "The loss of this payment caused our firm to default on commitments that we had given in good faith to other parties. It damaged our reputation in a market where reputation is the entire basis on which we do business. We assumed, as everyone assumes, that a check posted through the Royal Mail would arrive at the address on the envelope. We did not imagine that a uniformed postman would be the person to remove it." The jury convicted Ajaz Budi on all 8 counts. Sentencing was handed down at the Old Bailey by His Honor Judge John Bevan, a senior circuit judge with a reputation for the kind of careful, unsensationalized sentencing remarks that are read out at a steady pace and contain no wasted words. Judge Bevan addressed the courtroom directly. He noted that the theft from the Farringdon Road office had been carried out on what he described as a massive scale. He characterized the operation as among the largest and most sophisticated mail thefts by a serving postman that Royal Mail was aware of. He observed that the defendant had spent 19 years inside a uniform that the British public had been raised to trust, and that the breach of that trust was an aggravating factor that the sentence had to reflect. The judge sentenced Ajaz Budi to 8.5 years in custody. He was led down from the dock to begin the sentence the same afternoon. Initial reception was at HMP Belmarsh in southeast London. He was later transferred through the Category B and Category C prison estate to serve the bulk of his term in lower security conditions, with an expected release on license after serving approximately half of the headline sentence. The cash recovered from the 2 addresses was forfeited under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Confiscation proceedings against the wider network continued through the courts for years afterwards. Royal Mail issued a short statement after sentencing. The statement confirmed that Ajaz Budi had been dismissed from his employment with immediate effect, that the company had cooperated fully with the police investigation, and that internal controls at Mount Pleasant had been reviewed and tightened in light of the findings. The statement did not name any of the managers who had signed off on his uniformly unremarkable performance reviews across the 19 years he had worn the red Royal Mail crown on his chest. His wife filed for divorce. His 3 children grew up with a father in prison. The terraced house on Sanderstead Road, where the bundles of stolen envelopes had been pulled out from underneath the master bed at 6:51 on a Tuesday morning, was eventually sold to cover legal costs and outstanding restitution. The Mount Pleasant Mail Center is still operating today. The red uniform still goes through the staff exit on Phoenix Place every morning at the end of the early shift, and the postmen wearing it are still, overwhelmingly, doing exactly what postmen are supposed to do. This case was on a different level. But the one on your screen right now, the man in that uniform did something I still cannot quite believe.